What are we hearing?
So really, Paul, as you say, the initial deal that was penciled by the two sides in May that, of course, broke down those talks and ended up in acrimony. But that initial part of the deal is now being linked by the US and the Chinese sides to the extent to which they may be prepared to roll back on tariffs. Now, the Chinese demands at this point are that you get the 15% tariffs on $110 billion worth of goods that were imposed in September of this year removed immediately on the back of any phase one deal, and also the threat of additional tariffs come December the 15th taken off the table completely. What the Chinese are also prepared to do is see that the tariffs that were imposed back in 2018 be rolled back gradually. Now, those are tariffs on about $250 billion worth of goods. So where does the US stand in this? Well, the hardliners have apparently softened their stance to some extent in Washington, and you do have those members of the US administration who had been pushing for the $250 billion tranche to be held longer term as something of an enforcement mechanism to make sure that China lives up to its side of the deal. They are now accepting the option and the possibility of rolling those back gradually. The debate really is within the Washington and within the US official camp around the extent to which they roll back those tariffs, the degree to which they roll back those tariffs, and everything from 35% to 60% is what is in play in terms of percentages, and that debate continues. Lighthizer is pushing for 35%. Trump has said that the phase one deal could cover about 60% of all the different issues, and that could then be translated across to 60% of the tariffs. So it's anywhere between 35% to 60% of those tariffs that we're talking about. But again, that hasn't yet been finalized on the US side. And of course, there's big concern and there's growing concern about what happens after any phase one deal. Of course, phase two is something that Trump has said would start immediately after the signing of phase one. But again, those are the really complicated issues that most analysts think will be incredibly tough, analysts on both the Chinese side and the US side, for both Washington and Beijing to come to a consensus on. The other point worth making is that the People's Daily, the state media here, have said that President Xi is not going to be travelling outside of China again this year, which calls into question how the two presidents would sign this by the end of the year, because of the US, of course, have said that they would like to see this, or Trump has said he'd like to see the deal signed on US soil. Xi Jinping apparently not travelling outside of China before the end of the year.
So speaking of complications, Tom, how do the Hong Kong protests play into the trade talks?
Well, Vice President Mike Pence has made the point that if there is an escalation of violence, particularly from the Hong Kong authorities against those demonstrators and protesters, then it would make the prospect of a trade deal very hard indeed. This was in a radio interview that the Vice President gave. And of course, he's really talking about real politics, because we've just heard from Joe Sobchak talking about the fact that there is this bipartisan deal in the works now. This is one of those topics on which both the Republicans and the Democrats are aligned. And of course, this Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act that is passed already the House and now is going through the Senate, and as Joe was saying, very likely to be passed by both sides in terms of the House and the Senate, and then end up on Trump's table. That, of course, is something that is going to be likely inflaming the tensions with China. The Chinese foreign ministry has come out and said that this would be interfering in their domestic affairs, and they've threatened as well countermeasures should that bill be passed. So I think Vice President Mike Pence was talking really about the politics in Washington, the reality of the fact that if there's a major crackdown, a bloody crackdown in Hong Kong, then the politics of Washington would mean that it would be incredibly difficult to pass and get the political backing, at least, for a substantial deal with China on trade.